movements always want to be changed, and even even if, as sometimes is the case, they want things to go back to the way things used to be, right? If they want to make America great again, that is talking about a change in the status quo ante, and there's going to be some resistance to that. So do think about all this, and it will come up repeatedly, I think, today. The question of how a movement deals with adversaries in trying to obtain its outcomes. Also, now we want to think a bit more about goals. And so we should make that kind of conceptual divisions between organizations or movements based on the kind of goals that they seek. And so just with thinking about goals, I'm going to change my view here so I can see what you see. Oops. Yeah, okay. With thinking about goals, think about goals in terms of how discrete or how diffuse they are, right? So a discrete goal would be something like build the school or a school. This has been an issue in urban school districts time and time again, where the local schools are crowded. A group of parents gets together and says, "Build us a school," and the adversary there is the school district or the city or municipal government. But it's a really discrete goal. We're asking for one thing, and when we get our thing, if we get our thing, the movement will actually probably dissolve. May have some leftovers, but it will basically be done. We'll be happy. That'll be enough. You can have discrete goals, or you can have diffuse goals. Save the earth. What the fuck does that? Save the earth? Save the earth from what? From an asteroid? No, I mean, usually save the earth means, stop deforestation, don't build oil pipelines, stop driving diesel trucks, stop this, stop that, build this, do that, a whole ton of shit. So many things, right? Very, very diffuse. Which also means that for an organization, certainly for a movement, like I guess that's environmentalism in general, will have a hard time, knowing what success is. There'll be smaller successes along the way. If you get the EPA to more strictly regulate automobile emissions, right, that would be a success. If you get land set aside to be a forest preserve, okay, that's a success. But that movement is going to be wider ranging, longer in life potentially, and measurement of success is not going to be as clear, right? The outcomes are not going to necessarily be as clear. What does that do? What happens if that happens? Sorry, I'm still learning this. I'll still be playing with this forever. Okay. And more on outcomes, right? Discrete versus diffuse. Also, right. You don't have to achieve your stated goal to have a measure of success. let's call it success with failure. Their example was the Townsend movement. Really, I had to, this was one, I'm sure you didn't read about it in your high school history books, but the Townsend movement wanted basically a guaranteed annual income for persons age 60 or older. So the goal was, I guess you'd call it a defined pension or a universal pension. But the outcome was Social Security. Which was not and is not, right, remains based upon your lifetime earnings. So those who earn more and pay more into the pot take more out when they retire, right? So that's really, in one sense, a failure. They didn't get the guaranteed income for everybody. In another sense, though, certainly a success, and really from a demographic policy, whatever standpoint, America's elderly are much less poor than they used to be. The story, as I read it, and this is just Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt or whatever, but Townsend started the movement when he saw two little old ladies, and this was, I guess, in the 20s or the early 30s, saw two little old ladies going through his garbage looking for food, right? We don't see that anymore. So things have gotten better. So we don't always, don't always achieve our specific goals with a movement, but we may end up making the world a better place for the people we want to help. And also, I'm not quite sure how the rubric to put this under, but we'll also talk about success through non-action. And that's really when a threat is diffused. Think about historical preservationists. If you know these guys, historical preservationists, right? People, they're like, oh, it's the Miller House. It was built in 1920. They want to knock it down and make it into condos. They would be successful, right, if the Miller House doesn't get knocked down. And so groups that mobilize towards an end of preventing a threat from happening, they're successful when nothing happens. Of course, something that people in movements like that tend to say is, we have to win every time, right? So, like, this is especially like preservation of historical landmarks or preservation of public lands and that kind of thing. These threats emerge from time to time. In order to be successful, they have to be successful each and every time to make that non-action happen, to prevent an action from happening. But they lose forever if the developer comes in and knocks down the house and does build condos. Then the battle is lost permanently. Okay, so then going on, we should talk about these levels of success. I think it's really quite clear. But if you got your books handy, turn to page 126, right, and that gives you these. There they are. They're the 7 levels of success of a movement. That's not really super legible. Like I say, you'll probably want to pick up your book if you're following along. But right, what are the levels of success? I say there are 7. They only count 6, but the 7th level is the 0 level. No success, right? So when you're ignored and whatever it is that your goal was, you don't advance your goal at all. The preservationists who fail to keep a building in place, right? They failed. They didn't get listened to. But then, right, Burstein and company talk about these different levels, so you can get access, responsiveness. It is somewhat of a success if people just listen to you. If people in the government just pay a little bit of attention to you, that's access. If they put you on the agenda, so this would be, if the city council meeting has a conversation about this. I'm sorry, I'm always thinking, it's still been a couple weeks now since I watched Tiger King, but it's still on my mind. The next level here, agenda responsiveness. If you saw Tiger King, this is Carol Baskin got to go to Congress and talk to congressional meetings. That means that the legislators put animal rights on the agenda. That's a level of success that's necessary for the next level of success, which would be policy responsiveness, or where they actually crafted, and I guess they did. I think that there is some law about how many tigers you can own, something. I don't know exactly what she was looking for there, but she got some policy responsiveness. Then output is, do they actually enforce that? That's by the way kind of a huge thing that we especially see under the Trump administration with respect to things like environmental policy. It's one thing for Congress to pass a law, and most of the time you think okay, Congress passes a law and that's going to be enforced. No, silly citizens. We don't always do that, right? We don't always actually enforce the policies that are passed by the legislature. So and now in terms of things like whether it's food safety, probably tiger breeding or something is pretty far down the list of stuff that the USDA actually enforces, right? So output responsiveness there, level 4, does not necessarily follow from the policy, and then impact responsiveness is, does it have an impact on the population or the issue that you worried about? Carol Baskin, I guess, are there fewer tiger babies, lions being bred in captivity? If that is the case, then yes, then it's successful. And then finally, this level 6 would probably be the rarest of levels, although it's also the most nebulous. So this is the question of structural impacts. Do you change the social structure through your activism? And I mean, I'm having a hard time thinking of what that would look like in terms of Carol Baskin and wanting to save the tigers. But I guess if you get people across society to believe that keeping exotic animals is wrong, right? If you have people just across the board stop going to exotic animal parks, seeing that as a viable entertainment. That could be a structural success. Clearly, though, and again, this is rare, but clearly the more clear distinction, more clear examples would be in things like the civil rights movement, where across society that ended really broad social practices like Jim Crow, really called into question whether any kind of discrimination or segregation was a viable thing to do. Had not just one policy, but huge areas of policy that were changed. And now, ultimately, relations between people in society are significantly different than they were before the civil rights era. So, it's a nice way of looking at things. With any of this stuff, with all the stuff we're talking about today, this isn't certainly going to be the only way to look at things, but it provides a nice rubric. It puts a nice box around our thinking about movement outcomes. So if we can think about, does your movement have a positive policy impact, or does it have, actual output responsiveness, right? Do people enforce that new law, or were they only successful in a limited way, right? That's important to know. It's important as you focus on your movement outcomes. Okay, just kind of, and I'm like rearranging, bouncing stuff around here, vis-a-vis how Almeida arranges things. I think we also have to look at different kinds of outcomes. So that's all very much with respect to a governmental focus, where essentially the adversary of a movement is a government body. But it works at different levels of government, right? And remember, I'm not sure how much I've talked about this with you guys, and this is a little bit of the background that it's important to have, is to remember that in America there are at least three levels of governance that we focus on. The municipal level, right? So towns, cities, villages, they tend to regulate things like land use. So movements about, like a movement trying to prevent a dump from being built, or again, those preservationists tend to appeal to city governments. The state government is that sort of middle level there. They determine, quite a lot of policy, really. So like a lot of health policy, a lot of tax policy. You can appeal to states to have stricter environmental regulations. Clearly, we see that in California, or labor regulations. To some extent, land use, but again, that often falls at the local level. Schools very much are state level concern. And then, of course, the federal level. And when I said, Carol Baskin went to Congress, right, that's appealing to try to get a federal level law into place. So, again, though, that's just one kind of activism, kind of movement adversary, is those different levels of government. Remember that a movement can appeal, though, to particular institutions. So, the anti-sweatshop movement, for example, tends to, or has tended to, appeal to particular companies to say, hey, Nike, stop letting 6-year-olds make sneakers, or movements that are targeted towards educational institutions, right? Clearly, we had that last time in Hirsch's article about Colombia, right? You could say, certainly on a certain level, the activities of the anti-apartheid movement are ultimately aimed at the government in South Africa, were ultimately aimed at the government in South Africa. Proximally, though, the divestment movement at Columbia was aimed at the institution of Columbia University, saying, divest from your investments in firms that operate in South Africa, right? And often you'll see that, right? Of course, you've seen that in your own time at Eckerd, right? The protests, about how Eckerd handles sexual harassment and assault are aimed at this institution. Certainly they could be aimed, and there are other parts of that movement, or maybe we could consider that part of a broader movement that aims at getting better law crafted or better policy enacted at the government level. But just here, just recently, right, those activities are towards the school, this one institution. Also, though, remember that, or be able to focus on how the target, the goals can be sort of nebulous, right? So we talk about different adversaries here from levels of government to institutions and firms, more specifically. Outcomes can be, again, at the governmental level, and that's where that Bernstein, that table on 126, traces a lot of different government outcomes, but also wants you to be able to focus and think, in your case studies about other kinds of outcomes that a movement can have. And those include cultural outcomes. And when I teach, when I talk about culture, I say that the real main focus for us there is in terms of meaning. So a cultural outcome changes the meaning of something in society. So it's still on the board? Yeah, okay, it's still there. So examples of this, and also, again, remember, different movements, will have outcomes potentially at a variety of different levels. We'll have a variety of different goals. One, though, cultural outcome we see from a movement, if you remember back to our discussion of the Stonewall movement, the gay liberation movement, is just the meaning of, non-heteronormative sexuality in general has changed as a result of that social movement. You remember a big part of that was actually having people come out of the closet and sort of normalizing alternative sexualities, was a big outcome for that movement. Of course, they have lots of specific policy outcomes as well, but there's an important cultural outcome there as well. I would also point you to MAD, right? again, clearly part of MAD's success, and I think a large part of how they measured their success was in, how many states adopted the 0.08 cutoff for blood alcohol level, to try to reduce drunk driving. But, I think maybe even more important is that drunk driving is no longer seen as acceptable behavior in our society, where it really was, back through the 60s and 70s. I mean, you had to be absolutely shit hammered in order for people to think about taking away your keys back in the old days. Now it's really this whole culture around designated drivers. You have bars that give free soft drinks to designated drivers. A whole culture about calling cabs or leaving your car in a parking lot. If you have been drinking, right? So we really changed the culture there, and the movement can be credited for at least a certain portion of that cultural change. Also would point to individual level outcomes. Really, changing lives of people. And some of your movements, I think, are probably, almost laser focused on that level, or at least some of the time. So, I think about cults, right? What a cult is largely about is trying to get people to join that cult, or try, I guess, in maybe more favorable language to the cult, trying to get people to be spiritually awakened to, whether it's that Jim Jones is a Christ-like figure, or to accept the word of God or whatever it is. That's a real, internal, individual level outcome. They may not really care about, broader social outcomes. So there is that. Making the cult member, but then Almeida and a lot of the readings that we've been focusing on as well. I think back to the McAdam in particular, talks about how movements build activists. Even though Occupy Wall Street was policy-wise, it was a wash. It didn't really change the tax code or anything like that. It did sort of invigorate a new generation of people to be activists, right? And so if you participated in Occupy, you learned certain tactics of activism, and that is something that carries forward after the conclusion of the movement. And then, just at a kind of a nebulous level, I don't know. There are other legacies to movements. So I may have thrown this right in at the end. I don't think really has, and this is, of course, a short introduction to movements, right? So not really maybe adequately theorized, but there are these specific cultural outcomes that, really are often goals of movements. There's this kind of more nebulous sort of cultural outcome that has to do with things like tactics, that has to do with things like structural relations. Again, I think kind of under-theorized here. But clear. I mean, so clearly tactics would be one. The sit-in, right? That's just kind of part of the broader culture. It'd be hard to say that that was a goal of the lunch counter sit-in movement, was to teach people sit-ins are effective. But that's something that now people think of, right? Or in terms of structural relations. How do you even talk about this? It's like the fact that now maybe university and college administrations are more likely to engage with social movement actors rather than to combat them, right? That could be a legacy of the sit-ins at Columbia, those kinds of movements, right? Again, these are more kind of squishy, nebulous sort of things, but I think they are real and at least potentially important. Although certainly, probably the vast majority of movements have very little impact in terms of that. But of course, at the individual level, I think maybe all movements are arguably important in terms of making people into activists or making people skilled about engaging in political processes or other processes to try to make their world a better place. Okay, then strategy factors. Okay, this is a lot of stuff, right? So the mechanisms of the factors, but sorry, this is now turning to page 128. This gigantic table, right? We should be thinking about this now. So these are, they talk about it as factors for success to some extent. We might want to just put this under the rubric of tactics, although they specify tactics at some point. But this is kind of, again, a kitchen sink model. These are all the things that might contribute to a movement's success. I would say, though, that as with the recruitment stuff we were talking about last time, again, these factors are neither exhaustive nor mutually exclusive, right? So there's certainly going to be other factors that you'll see in studies that are held up as important to why a movement succeeded or failed. And we'll see as we kind of review this list, some of these factors look very similar to each other, and that's okay, right? As you think through again your own case studies and your own sort of thinking about why or whether your movements were successful, your organizations were successful or not. Reflect on these different ones, but recognize that they may not be salient in every case, right? So different cases have clearly different factors, different combinations of factors, and maybe something that's missing here. Although this is a pretty long list, right? So it does get us pretty close, I think. I hope to the heart of the matter, to understanding why some movements are successful or not. So the different factors related to success, and again, nice, pretty clear stuff. So movement strategy factors is where we begin. They start with framing, which clearly we've talked about before, so I don't want to go over that again, but recognize if framing is important, right? A hugely important strategy. Although, as that one article that we read reminded us, framing ain't everything, right? So framing ain't everything. And then other things in terms of strategy, they talk about disruptive and novel tactics. So and probably should also put in here, you know, that to some extent, non-disruptive and normal tactics are a thing as well. So, you know, the literature tends to emphasize these disruptive or new tactics, but I think we have to remember there's some bias in in the social sciences in terms of what we choose to study. And so we love to study spectacular stuff. We hate to study boring stuff. On a different level, we love to study cities and urban movements, you know, with respect to movement specifically, because these are the places where sociologists want to live, right? You know, I want to live in Chicago. I want to live in New York. So there's so many studies of New York, Chicago, LA. There are not nearly as many studies of rural America, and especially like we barely know what is going on Indian reservations because nobody wants to live there. You know, and that's, you know, that's a broad critique, a broad problem in the social sciences and sociology specifically. Also, though, you know, just kind of speaking to this disruptive tactic thing, you know, we love to study crazy movements, but, you know, a mundane movement that moves through the normal channels of government is not going to draw so much attention. You know, is not going to fight as hard a fight, is not going to get so much mention in the news. But, you know, if a group of parents want a new school to be built and they lean on their legislators to do so, you know, that's not going to rise up to the level of something that sociologists are going to pay attention to if they go through the normal channels and they're successful. So, you know, where Almeida says, you know, oh, disruptive movements are, you know, that's a way to be successful. Not always, right? That's I think that's, you know, in part about what we're paying attention to. That being said, disruptive tactics, right? So what he's talking about here is disruptive tactics are things like the Columbia sit-in, things that disrupt everyday business, especially for elites. And he rightly points out here as well that, you know, if you're going to use those disruptive tactics, you ought to have political or public opinion on your side, at least to some extent, because there can be a backlash. So I think about the anti-war movements in the early 2000s. You know, he talks about Haney and Rojas's work on that movement. You know, part of what that movement did, you know, he's like, yeah, well, wow, they were disruptive, but they were unsuccessful, even though they were huge, right? But they, you know, they only had a portion of public opinion on their side, and they did some really disruptive things like marching on freeways in LA, marching on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. At that point, you know, again, the public opinion was soft to begin with. You know, they didn't have public opinion on their side, really. It was a you know, a minority of Americans who were anti-war to begin with. But then you do something that disrupts a lot of people's lives, and they just think you're an asshole, right? So if like you make it so that nobody can get home from work at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday because you're having a march on Lakeshore Drive, that disruptive kind of tactic can really, you know, backfire on you. Again, though, as opposed to successful instances like the Columbia sit-ins, where those disruptive tactics get a lot of attention, and, you know, you've already got some public opinion on your side. You know, now you get the ball rolling, and you really make it so that elites have to pay attention to you. You're affecting their bottom line. So those disruptive tactics can be successful. Novel tactics are things like we talked about those ACT UP die-ins, where you had people pretending to be dead, or where you had those examples of holding very public funerals and taking the body to a political office. That's unusual. That's novel. And again, though, that's a framing thing as well. That's sort of framing the problem of AIDS a little bit differently than it had been framed for people. Now it's really about death and dying. The novel spectacular technique is going to get press, because the press loves a good spectacular story. So you're going to get more mass media attention, or even social media attention nowadays, right? That's an Instagram worthy moment if you bring an open coffin to somebody's political offices. Size, clearly, is important. The bigger the movement, the more people will pay attention to you. If it's a firm, they're worried about boycotts. So the more people boycotting them, the more problematic that is. If it is a government, they're worried ultimately about electoral politics. Right? So if a lot of people really are behind an issue, elected officials will pay attention. And then, yes, enduring infrastructure. Remember that even unsuccessful movements, or a broader movement that is failing some of the time, is still building up a network, is building up a bureaucratic structure, which might be successful in the future. And if you think of a thing like a Sierra Club, they might protest against a dam being built, fail to get that dam not built. Is that the goddamn dam when the goddamn dam got built, they failed, right? But if they have this enduring bureaucracy that they have built up, then that can be a sort of a factor in future successes for them. Okay, turning then to this question of external allies, or these factors of external allies and coalition. Again, some old hat for us, hopefully, at this point. Youth and students, he doesn't use the term, but remember, kids have that biographical availability. They have a lot of time on their hands to go to protests, or to take a summer off and participate in like a freedom summer. Also, he points out block recruitment there with the youth. So especially at bigger universities more, but Eckerd could have that sort of a thing too. It's like, everybody in the vegan club might go join in a protest, against a fur factory or something like that, right? The block recruitment meaning, you don't have to go from individual to individual saying, join our protest, blah, blah, blah. You go to the club organizer. The club organizer says, yeah, I can have 30 people at your protest tomorrow. That's a whole block of students. And because students are in these infrastructural situations and have the time on their hands, they can be recruited like that. Experts and professionals, right? This is an important point to make. Again, I'm not writing this stuff on the board because this is pretty clearly laid out in your book. But if you have questions, issues, stop me anytime, right? Throw something up in the chat, or turn your mic on and holler at me, and we can slow down. Experts and professionals, though, right? So he's a little cursory in this. Clearly, lawyers. You need lawyers for a lot of actions, especially if you're going to use the tactic of filing lawsuits. The other point, though, about experts and professionals is that you can often get them to work for you for free or at a very reduced rate because they believe in the goals of your movement. Also, probably should note, he's obviously Almeida is focused more on liberal movements, and especially people like scientists and social scientists tend to be more liberal. So these liberal movements have the ability to recruit from there. So again, lawyers are important. Different kinds of researchers can be important as well. And there are, in terms of career paths for social scientists, this is another career path for social scientists, because movements like the Sierra Club or 350.org, they hire people with at least bachelor's degrees to do some of these research and write these reports for the organization to advance their causes, because evidence matters, right? And you need experts to provide that evidence. I think we've talked about this before, but other social movements, right? This is a little bit in terms of the frame bridging literature also speaks to this. But you can draw on different social movements, different social movement organizations in particular to support your movement. Almeida stresses the role of labor unions. And again, this is a sort of a source of block recruitment. If you can get everybody at the local UAW hall to protest, he really focuses on the Fight for 15, right? Fight for 15 is through SEIU, but other labor unions could certainly join in there because it is something that they can get behind. It's close to their stated goals. Maybe not directly in their stated goals, but they are sympathetic enough that they might want to join in a protest or as signatories or something like that, or donate money to the cause. Religious organizations, again, but that's, be a little cognizant that depends on the social movement at hand. It really has to be close to the religious organization in one respect or another. But of course, as you're probably aware, there are very different kinds of congregations and churches in America, in particular, globally. For example, Salvadoran rebels, Guatemalan rebels, were supported in part by some Catholics, right? So certain Catholic priests and congregations who adhered to a liberation theology, ideology, although they were often sort of, working maybe not exactly in the way that the diocese or the Vatican would have wanted them to work. A little closer to home, there are certain churches around here who work, for example, with the Immokalee workers, see it as their Christian duty to support the downtrodden. On the other side of the political spectrum, though, you're probably quite aware of religious support for things like abortion clinic protests, those kinds of things. And so, again, Catholic and evangelical denominations would work against that. Again, it's a good way to get a lot of people on your side, because the parish priest or the minister can say, we're having this protest this weekend. I would like as many of you as can, to come out and save the fetuses. Oppositional political parties, although again, I think to some extent, Almeida does us a little bit of a disservice in his real focus on oppositional movements, on the movements of the downtrodden. So we don't hear as much as we could about right-wing movements, about again, things like the anti-abortion movement. So he emphasizes oppositional political parties. That's not across the board. Certainly, more of clearly more of the progressive movements are drawing on the support of oppositional political parties. His point is, along the lines of saying something like, the party in opposition, might want to align themselves with, say, a group of environmentalists, because that's a way for the party to gain some support. And he's saying that oppositional parties, which means parties that are not, the majority party or not the party in power, are going to look to social movements, are maybe going to change their party platforms, their party emphasis to appeal to social movements, and then provide a national level infrastructure to the social movement that the social movement can draw upon. So, for example, this would be like the Democratic Party supporting the Fight for 15. That gives a broad infrastructural support to that movement. Again, though, like I was saying, maybe a little too much emphasis here on the oppositional nature of things. And so you can think of, right-wing movements, again, the anti-abortion movement, as being not aligned with an oppositional party, but really aligned with the party in power, and deriving, again, infrastructural support from that party in power. And again, he's saying, that this is parties are some of the only national structures left in the neoliberal era. I think that's questionable. Especially in the social media era. So you don't have to align yourself with a national political party, I think, to have a national impact. You got to do framing, you got to have a bureaucracy, but I think he sometimes overstates this idea of how deep into the neoliberal era we are, or how much national infrastructures have fallen apart for different things. His point there is that labor unions used to be, much bigger, which is absolutely true, and be much more supportive of movements. Okay, that's fine. I don't think that means that that only leaves parties as the organizations with a national level infrastructure, right? Parties are part of the picture, but there are plenty of national movements that don't need a political party to succeed. The Me Too movement is a decent example of that, something that kind of really organically arose over just the course of a few months and developed quickly a national infrastructure. And part of that speaks to his next point, or next factor here on page 129 of the mass media and social media. So, you got to have media for movements, or at least to grow a movement. And again, here's where disruptive tactics comes in to some extent. That really, doing crazy stuff again gets the attention of the media. But again, like we saw with Gamson talking about Delaware. What was he talking about? Women's, anti-domestic abuse organizations in Delaware. It behooves an organization to develop relationships with the media. to feed them stories, but also to help them craft narratives in ways that are, I guess, kind to the movement, or that speak, in that example, the idea was really to try to get away from any sense that women were complacent in their abuse, right? So really to teach the media how to frame those stories of abuse, and to call on movement activists when there are relevant stories. If you've developed those relationships, now the movement can potentially pick up some adherence, potentially pick up more traction, remain in people's minds even when maybe they're not as active as they are at other times. So right, he stresses mass media, but then again, the mass media in America is in a very serious transition period now, and so he puts a lot of positive emphasis on social media, and clearly we've seen that there has been a positive role for social media, especially in terms of things like recruiting people to Occupy Wall Street and those kinds of movements. But again, caveat here, and this will go with, wait, did I miss something? Maybe I missed something. Yeah, I missed something somewhere. Oh no, that's down there. Okay. We'll talk about astroturfing in a moment. Social media can be something like that, right? And this is, when did he write this? I think he should have been up on this. Yeah, this is from 2019. He should have been thinking as well about the manipulability of social media. A lot of us now are really, partly because things are still in flux. The nature of social media is changing, but largely because we saw how manipulable social media was in the 2016 election in particular. A lot of us question the possibilities of social media, question certainly how positive a force that it is. And the real concern, there are multiple concerns here. One of them is the issue of siloing. So rather than being able to attract new people to your movement because of the way social networks work, because of the way algorithms work, especially with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you only see messages, images, whatever, that aligns with your preconceived interests. So a lot of us are worried that this is not, you want to get more people to sign up for the environmental movement. You're not going to expand the movement through social media, right? You're gonna keep talking to the same people over and over again. You're going to be unlikely to reach across the divide into those other silos because the media just doesn't work that way. Or the medium doesn't work that way. The media, okay. Facebook, Twitter, etc. The other thing, right? So there's the siloing effect, and then there is the outright propaganda, the subversion of social media by, of course, the 2016 election. The focus was on the Russians, but clearly, bots to some extent, real paid people are manipulating the media to generate either apathy or panic about certain issues over others. So I tend to be focused, and maybe this is my own political blinders. I tend to be focused on the kind of disinformation campaigns that are appealing to right-wing people. So things like claims that the government wants to take all your guns, right? That's ginning up a fake social movement that really works against social movements that try to control, get some gun control measures passed. Currently, I don't know how much you're paying attention to these people who seem to believe. I haven't looked hard into this, but seem to believe that there is some association between 5G networks and the coronavirus. I have no idea why they want people to think this way, but this seems to be a somewhat coordinated disinformation campaign to get, clearly poorly educated people to believe that somehow they're sending out the coronavirus through cellular networks. And I don't know what the end game there would be. Just driving up fear, driving up a lack of confidence in the government. I don't know, but it's clear that undermines good public health efforts. Be measured in your assessment of the possibilities of social media. And again, I tend to focus on the bullshit coming from the right or from Russia, which tends to be appealing towards right-wing Americans. But that's not to say that some of this isn't happening on the left as well. We know that the Russians were promoting Jill Stein as well. So this can come to anyone potentially through their social media networks. So be careful, be measured in your assessments there. Then state actors, right, as another factor. What is the heading here, right? External allies. The other ally you can develop are state actors. Again, a little bias, I think, on Almeida's part here towards progressive movements, but B, disruptive movements. He fails to mention legislators, but again, you can, and movements do try to go through the normal channels to achieve their goals. And so legislators would be one kind of state actor that you want on your side. Almeida highlights things like individual bureaucrats, government agencies. He gives the example of somebody in the EPA who worked against state officials. So EPA is a federal organization, worked against state officials to expose the Flint water crisis. And certainly different EPA officials in particular have acted as whistleblowers, as allies at different times of various wings of the environmental movement. So, but just generally, you would think, if you're in a movement, you should have an eye on what the relevant government agencies are and consider if you might find allies in those agencies. Also, so he points out, some of these actors are acting, if you work for the EPA, there's a good chance that you are something of an environmentalist. So some of these people work with movements, altruistically. He also mentions, sometimes people will act with a movement to further their political ambitions. And that can work in your favor, although recognize that politics makes for kind of fair weather friends. So somebody who's your friend on one bill may not support your efforts on another bill if he's trying to speak to another constituent or another donor at that particular time. Okay, and then all right, so those are the facts. So those are your allies, right? State actors, the media, experts, organizations, religious organizations. Um, you'll also have to pay attention to the political environment. And again, these are things that we have been talking about all along. But really, again, to focus them, put a fine point on them. He talks about public opinion and how that can facilitate or hamper a movement. The really important takeaway here, though, is that, and again, we have seen a little bit of this, is that if public opinion isn't on your side, you might want to, rather than focus your movement on protests or on legislative action, then you focus your movement on framing activities and teaching activities, right? So having things like teach-ins or seminars or putting up tables at the local farmers market or buying commercials to educate the public, to bring public opinion around. So something like, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of spitballing here. If you want to have like an anti-coal movement, especially if you want to do that in like West Virginia, that's not going to really fly, right? So many people make their money off of coal. If you can somehow, start running TV ads about, how it's polluting the lakes or killing babies and birds, that's where you're going to want to focus your energy until you bring public opinion around, and then you might be able to get people to start writing their legislators or engaging in protests to mine less coal, that kind of a thing. Elite conflict. This goes back. We've talked about this, early on. But when elites are in conflict with each other, that's a good time to slip in some real policy change. I think some of this, is what's been going on during the coronavirus legislation. Everybody's like, everybody's like going nutty, and the Democrats and Republicans like have to work with each other, but the businesses and some businesses are benefiting, and some businesses are getting really screwed, and so they're all fighting with each other, and so that creates a unique opportunity to step in and say like, hey, well, all that's going on, like, why don't you put some guaranteed income legislation into this next bill, and that'll get you some more constituents, some more votes next time around. So when things are wacky. So this is the colloquial way of putting it. When things are wacky, that creates an opportunity for you. When elites, on the other hand, are kind of business as usual, and they're all aligned with one another, then it's tough to get reform across. Elite blunders. I like that. A blunder. A blunder is an opportunity. Although there's another saying too. A crisis is an opportunity. I guess that kind of speaks towards the conflict position. But crises, blunders are also opportunities for movement. What he means in terms of blunders is things like the Panama Papers. I'm not sure quite how that works. I mean, the Panama Papers worked to get some individuals out of the government in certain places. I guess you could think, though, about something like the Enron crisis, right? So the elites fucked up their, I guess, we were talking about this in another class the other day. You guys probably don't remember the Enron crisis. Oh, but you probably vaguely remember the Great Recession. That we could construe that as a blunder amongst the elites, right? They had deregulated the securities industry to the extent that it allowed the entire economy to kind of fold in on itself. That opened up an opportunity for more legislation, and I'm forgetting the Dodd-Frank reforms, is part of that. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau that Elizabeth Warren used to be the head of before she was the senator from Massachusetts came out of all that. Things to really rein in the worst excesses of elite bankers really could only come in when those bankers screwed up in a massive, fabulous way. Other blunders, though, as kind of on an even more horrific scale, we've seen what does he call it? He calls it something like extreme state repression. When the state goes kind of beyond the level of repression that even supporters of the state can support, then that's an opportunity. The kind of, the really horrific side that we saw of this in El Salvador was when the state was going in and burning villages and killing large numbers of basically innocent peasants. That really swayed political opinion in a lot of these villages against the state and drove up recruitment for the FMLN. It doesn't have to be quite that bad. This can be, just responses to riots and that sort of thing. But when the state becomes repressive, that does have a tendency. Sometimes the state is repressive and successful in that repression. Tiananmen was an example of that. And so in '89, when the Chinese sent in the tanks and killed a lot of protesters, that was successful. But certainly there have been times, I think the Hong Kong protests to some extent, there were a lot of people who were on the fence about the Hong Kong protests until the state came in and started cracking more heads, at which people said, wait a minute, we can't support this state, right? We're going to support the protesters, even if we don't support everything they stand for, because we definitely are not okay with the state repressing them. And then finally, within the political environment factors, Almeida discusses counter movements. So these are movements that exist to defeat or demean or delegitimate a social movement. In some respects, these are real and organic movements. So the anti-abortion versus pro-choice. Clearly there are people who believe very strongly on either side, and clearly each exists as a counter movement to the other. But this is the astroturfing point. Often counter movements arise as counter movements arise that are supported by, that are bought for and paid by either firms or political elites. Again, we call it astroturfing because they try to appear to come from the grassroots. And this is the term. Grassroots organizing is organizing of ordinary citizens to enact some kind of change. And we call it astroturfing when, say, this is a terrible example, but if Nike paid a bunch of people to stage a counter protest against a counter protest in favor of sweatshops, right? So if Nike paid all these people to be like, we love sweatshops, we love sneakers, we love cheap sneakers, and sweatshop protesters are stupid or something like that. Not that they would actually do that, but anything along those lines. The real example that comes to my mind is something that happened in 2000, the Bush v. Gore election. There was something that's been termed the Brooks Brothers riot, where a bunch of guys who apparently were like in suits were like staged a protest. I think at the either Broward or Miami-Dade election supervisor offices to interrupt the recount, to say that like, oh, this is unfair and Bush won and we should stop, all this bullshit. Those people were bought and paid for by Roger Stone. Were Stone cronies and people that were paid for. And again, more recently, we've seen the Russians doing some of this weird stuff. Like apparently there was this float that was going around that was like a dummy representation of Hillary Clinton in a jail cell that was supposed to be like, just like, a bunch of ordinary people were putting that together to bring to Trump rallies and parades and things. And it turns out that those people were paid for by the Russians. So again, that's astroturfing, and that's a way that elites try to build up counter movements against legitimate or grassroots social movements. Also, though, should finally note here that we include groups like the Klan as counter movements, and should recognize that violence can be, has been, often is maybe a tactic against movements. And clearly we don't always know where this is coming from. So there's certainly evidence that the reality was that the Klan in a lot of places in the United States, in the South, was supported by government actors. So the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer, those were done by the Klan, but apparently sanctioned by the sheriff and other local officials. We see this time and again, especially in authoritarian states. You saw this in, I think we watched a little bit of this, or I watched a little bit of this when we were talking about the Arab Spring, just these apparently random groups of people who rode horses into Tahrir Square and attacked people. They weren't official government forces, but it seems fairly clear that they were paid for by government forces, and that it's a common tactic, to make social movement activities riskier, more dangerous, less appealing to people. Should also note that's frequently a failed counter movement tactic, because violence, as Hirsch pointed out, is a form of polarization, and people who are experiencing violence toward their cause can become even more devoted to their cause. And so those people in Tahrir Square did not leave when they experienced violence. They even came back in stronger numbers. Now, of course, violence may crack a movement's support, crack its backbone, but it can also certainly galvanize a movement. Okay, that's all I have planned for today. Sorry for kind of word salad and just progressing through what you have there in the book. What I would encourage you to do, if we were in a classroom situation, I would probably say, sit down with these different factors and, some of the primary sources you have on your movements, and think about, like, does this apply? Does that apply? Does this other thing apply or not? Right? Because not every movement is going to see all of these factors. Are there questions, concerns, issues? Everybody's quiet. Everybody's satisfied. Okay. Well, I'll say stay healthy, stay occupied. Keep a hand in the game, trying to get these case studies out. We'll have a presentation on Tuesday by Lena on the women's movement, and I'm going to be talking about the environmental movement. And again, the focus is on outcomes right now, and the different factors that lead to positive or negative outcomes for a movement. Other than that, not seeing questions, I guess I'm going to let you go. So enjoy your weekends, and I'll see you on Tuesday.